never asked her to call me Dad. 63 years on this earth, and the one thing I learned about being a stepfather is that the title isn't yours to claim. You earn it, or you don't. And either way, you keep your mouth shut about it. My name is Wesley. I'm a retired structural engineer out of Spokane, Washington. I spent 31 years signing off on bridges and parking garages, and a couple of hospitals you've probably driven past without thinking twice about. I'm telling you that because I want you to understand what kind of man I am. I check the math. I check it twice. I don't put my name on something unless I know it'll hold weight. That's how I was raised, and that's how I lived. And I suppose that's how I ended up where I ended up. I met her mother, Ingrid, at a grief counseling group at the Lutheran Church on 14th Avenue. This was the spring of 2009. My first wife had passed from pancreatic cancer 11 months before, and I was still showing up every Tuesday because the basement of that church was the only place I could cry without anybody acting embarrassed about it. Ingrid sat across the circle from me one night and said her husband had walked out into a snowstorm in February of 2008, and they'd found his truck 2 counties over, but never found him. She had a daughter, 11 years old, named Bryn. She said the girl hadn't spoken more than 5 sentences since the funeral they held without a body. I didn't go to that group looking for a woman. I want that on the record. But Ingrid had this way of laughing at the worst possible moments. This dry little laugh that wasn't really a laugh. More like a punctuation mark she put at the end of sentences that were too sad to finish. I walked her to her car the 3rd Tuesday in a row, and the 4th, and by the 6th, she asked me if I wanted to come over for dinner. She said Bryn might not say a word the whole time. She said, "Don't take it personally." I didn't. The first time I met that little girl, she was sitting at the kitchen table with a math worksheet, and she was crying because she couldn't figure out long division. Ingrid was at the stove and her hands were shaking, and I could tell she was about to lose it herself. I sat down next to Bryn and I didn't say anything for a minute. I just looked at the worksheet. Then I picked up the pencil and I drew a little house around the problem with a chimney and a door, and I wrote the divisor on the doorstep and the dividend inside the house. I told her the divisor was knocking. I told her our job was to figure out how many times it could come in. She stopped crying. She did 3 problems while I sat there. When she got the 4th one right, she looked up at me with this expression I'll remember until they put me in the ground. It wasn't love. It was something more careful than love. It was a kid deciding whether or not I was safe. I married Ingrid 18 months later in October of 2010. Bryn was 12. She wore a navy blue dress, and she handed her mother the ring at the courthouse. And afterward we went to a steakhouse on Division Street, and Bryn ordered the filet. And when the waiter came back with the bill, she looked at me and said, "Thank you, Wesley." Not Dad. Not anything else. Wesley. Not Dad. Not anything else. Wesley. And I told her she could have ordered 2 if she wanted. She laughed. She actually laughed. That was the high point. I should have stamped that in my memory like a coin. 13 years old, laughing in a steakhouse on Division Street. Before everything else, here's what the next 15 years look like in case you've never been a stepfather and you're wondering how it goes. I paid for her braces. Twice because she lost the retainer the first time, and we had to redo half the work. I paid for the trip to Costa Rica her sophomore year of high school, the one her Spanish class took. I paid for the tutor when she was failing geometry. I taught her to drive in the parking lot of the Albertsons on Indiana Avenue. Both hands on the wheel, kid, both hands. I paid for her totaled Corolla and then the Civic that replaced it. I paid for her first apartment deposit when she went to community college, and her second one when she transferred to Eastern Washington, and her third one when she decided she wanted to live in Seattle and intern at a marketing firm that paid her in lunch vouchers. I paid for the U-Haul. I drove the U-Haul. 300 miles each way, and I slept on her floor that night because the bed frame wasn't assembled yet, and in the morning she made me instant coffee in a chipped mug, and she said, "You didn't have to do all this, Wesley." And I said, "I know." And she said, "Thank you." And I drove home. I want to be clear about one thing. Her mother contributed. Ingrid worked as a dental hygienist, and she put in what she could. But I made about 4 times what she did, and the math of the marriage was that I covered the big stuff. The college tuition, The car insurance. The medical bills when Bryn got mono her junior year. The therapist Bryn started seeing at 19, when she finally wanted to talk about her father, the one she didn't remember well, the one who walked into a snowstorm. I paid for that therapist for 2.5 years. I never asked Bryn what they talked about. I figured it wasn't mine to know. And here's the part I want you to understand, because it matters for what comes later. I never once told her she had to call me Dad. I never corrected her when she introduced me as Wesley to her friends. I never put my name on her school forms unless Ingrid asked me to. When she graduated from high school, I sat in the third row and I clapped. And when she got her diploma, she walked off the stage and hugged her mother first. And then she hugged me. And she said, "Thank you for coming." And I said, "Wouldn't have missed it." I meant it. I don't know if you can be too careful with a kid who lost her father. I tried to be. I thought I was doing it right. Looking back, I wonder if I was so careful about not pushing that I let her drift, that I let her decide I was furniture, that I let her grow up without ever having to defend my place in her life. Because I'd quietly made sure I didn't have one worth defending. Maybe. I don't know. I'm not a therapist. I just paid for one. She got engaged in the spring of last year. She was 26. The fiancé was a young man named Holden, an account executive at the marketing firm she'd interned at. He was tall, polite, came from money. His parents were lawyers in Bellevue. The first time he came to our house for dinner, he shook my hand and called me sir, and he kept calling me sir all through the meal. And at the end of the night, he said, "It was real nice to meet you, sir." And I told him, "Please call me Wesley," and he said, "Yes, sir." I liked him. I want to put that down too. I liked Holden. He seemed kind. He seemed like the kind of young man who'd been raised right. The engagement party was in June. Ingrid threw it at our house in the backyard with a tent and a caterer and about 40 people. I paid for it. I didn't make a fuss about paying for it. I just paid for it. The way I paid for everything else, because that was the arrangement, and because I loved them, and because money is the easiest thing in the world to give if you've got it. Bryn pulled me aside that night after the tent guys had taken down the tent. She was a little drunk. She put her arms around me and she said, "Wesley, I want you to know I'm so grateful for everything." I said, "You don't have to thank me." She said, "No, I do. I really do." She said, "You've been such a good friend to my mom, a good friend to her mom." I want you to hear that the way I heard it. I want you to hear what's in it. 26 years old and 4 glasses of champagne in, and the most generous thing she could find to say about me was that I'd been a good friend to her mother. I'd been there for 15 years. I taught her to drive. I paid for her teeth, and I was a friend of the family. I smiled at her, and I said, "Thanks, kiddo." I went inside. I stood at the kitchen sink, and I rinsed 2 wine glasses, and I went to bed. I want to tell you what happened next without making it sound dramatic, because the truth is, it wasn't. Drama is what happens when one big thing falls. This wasn't one big thing. This was 100 small things lined up in a row, and somebody finally tipped the first one over. The wedding was set for the second Saturday in October. The venue was a winery in Walla Walla, 3 hours south. The guest list was around 140. The total budget Ingrid quoted me in July, when she sat me down with a spreadsheet, was $41,000. I looked at the spreadsheet. I checked the math. It was actually $43,200, but I didn't say anything about the $2,000 because I figured she'd rounded down out of guilt. I wrote her a check for $15,000 to cover the venue deposit and the caterer, and I told her we'd handle the rest as it came due. She kissed me on the forehead. She said, "You're a good man, Wesley." She said this in the tone of someone confirming a piece of trivia, the way you might say Boise is the capital of Idaho. The bridal shower was in August. The bachelorette weekend was in late August in Scottsdale, and I paid for Bryn's flight and her share of the rental. The rehearsal dinner deposit went out in early September. The wedding dress alterations, the second round, after Bryn lost 6 pounds from wedding stress, came to almost $900, and I covered that without being asked. By the 3rd week of September, I had put roughly $28,000 on the line for an event I was not going to be paid back for, was not going to be reimbursed for, and did not expect to be reimbursed for. That was the deal. I was the stepfather. The stepfather pays. The phone call came on a Tuesday night, the last Tuesday in September. 2.5 weeks before the wedding. Bryn called the house. She asked to speak to her mother first. They were on the phone for 40 minutes. I could hear Ingrid's voice rising and falling in the kitchen. I couldn't make out the words. After she hung up, Ingrid came into the living room where I was watching a Mariners game, and she sat down on the love seat across from me and she said, "We need to talk." I muted the TV. She told me Bryn wanted to have a conversation with me. She said Bryn had been thinking a lot about the wedding and about what it meant to her and about who she wanted there. She said Bryn had been going through some things in therapy. She said Bryn was going to call me back in about an hour and she wanted me to listen with an open heart. I knew before the phone rang. You spend 40 years checking math. You develop a feel for when a number doesn't sit right. Bryn called at 9:15. I picked up on the second ring. I said, "Hi, sweetheart." She said, "Hi, Wesley." She didn't waste time. I'll give her that. She said she'd been doing a lot of work on herself this past year. She said she'd been thinking about her father, her real father, the one who'd walked into the snow when she was 10. She said she'd realized something important. She said the wedding was a sacred day for her, a day about her origins, and she wanted it to be a day that honored where she truly came from. She said her mother's brother, her uncle, was going to walk her down the aisle because he was blood and her father wasn't there to do it, and blood mattered to her. I said, "Okay." She said, "And Wesley, the thing is, I love you. I really do, but I've been thinking, and I think the greatest gift you could give me on my wedding day is to not be there." I didn't say anything for a second. She kept going. She said it wasn't personal. She said her therapist had helped her understand that having me at the wedding would be confusing for her, that it would muddy the meaning of the day, that she needed the day to be about her real family. She said, "You're not my real dad, Wesley. You're just Wesley." She said, "You've always been Wesley. And I love you. But this is about something bigger than us." I said, "Okay." She waited. I think she was waiting for me to argue. I didn't. She said, "I hope you understand." She said, "Mom and I have talked about it, and she supports me. She wants this day to be what I need it to be." I said, "Okay." She said, "Wesley," I said, "I heard you, sweetheart." I said, "I understand." I said, "I appreciate you calling me yourself." She said, "You're not mad?" I said, "I'm not mad." She said, "Okay." She said, "The budget, we still need to figure out the rest of the payments." And I said, "I know." I said, "Don't worry about that tonight." I said, "We'll figure it out." She said, "I love you, Wesley." I said, "Good night, sweetheart." I hung up. I sat there for a long time. The Mariners were losing. I remember that. They were losing to the Astros, and the bottom of the 8th was just starting. And I sat there with the phone in my hand and watched a man strike out looking on a slider that was clearly a ball. And I thought about all the times I'd taught Bryn how to figure out whether to swing. Ingrid came in. She sat down. She said, "Honey." She said, "I know that was hard." I looked at her. I said, "You knew about this." She said, "I knew she wanted to talk to you." I said, "You knew what she was going to say." She didn't answer right away. Then she said, "Yes." She said, "But Wesley, you have to understand, this is her day. This is her process. She's been through so much. And her uncle, my brother, he's offered to step in for the financial side too. He said he could cover the rest of the wedding costs, so you don't have to worry about that part." I want to pause here and tell you something about Ingrid's brother. His name was Curtis. He sold commercial real estate in Coeur d'Alene. He'd been to our house for Thanksgiving exactly twice in 15 years. He'd never sent Bryn a birthday card. He'd never come to a graduation. He'd told me once at a barbecue that he didn't understand how a man could let himself be roped into raising someone else's kid. He said that to my face, holding a beer, in my own backyard, and Ingrid had laughed it off and changed the subject. That was the man who was going to walk my stepdaughter down the aisle. That was the man who was suddenly offering to cover the wedding budget I'd already put $28,000 into. I looked at my wife. I said, "How long has Curtis been involved in this?" She said, "A few weeks." I said, "How many weeks?" She said, "Maybe 2 months." I said, "2 months." She said, "Wesley, please don't be like this." I said, "Like what?" She said, "Wounded." She said, "Don't be wounded." It's not about you. I want you to sit with that sentence. I want you to roll it around. Don't be wounded. It's not about you. I went to bed. I didn't sleep. I lay there next to a woman I had been married to for 15 years, and I did the math on my own life. The way I'd done the math on every bridge I'd ever signed off on. I added up the load. I added up the stress. I checked the joints. I figured out where the structure was carrying weight. It was never designed to carry. In the morning, I made coffee and I drove to my attorney's office downtown. His name was Calloway, and I'd known him since we worked on a parking structure together in the 90s. I sat in his office for 2 hours. Here's what I did over the next 11 days. I'm going to tell you in order because the order matters. I stopped payment on the rehearsal dinner deposit. The caterer hadn't cashed it yet. I called the venue in Walla Walla, and I explained that the family had decided to restructure the wedding financially, and that all further payments should go through Curtis, whose contact information I provided. I emailed Ingrid the contact information for the wedding planner so she could update the billing. I canceled the auto pay I had set up for the florist. I called the band. I called the photographer. Each conversation took about 4 minutes. I didn't badmouth anyone. I just explained that there'd been a change in who was handling the finances and to please direct future invoices accordingly. Then I called my financial advisor. I had 3 joint accounts with Ingrid and 4 accounts in my name only. The accounts in my name only contained the bulk of my retirement, the bulk of the money from selling my engineering firm, and an inheritance from my father. I'd never commingled that money. Calloway had told me 20 years ago not to, and I'd listened. I transferred everything in those 4 accounts to a new account at a different bank. I left the joint accounts alone. They had enough in them to cover the mortgage for 6 months and Ingrid's share of expenses for about a year. Then I called a realtor. The house we lived in was in my name. I bought it in 2003, 6 years before I met Ingrid. She had moved into it. We had never refinanced it into both names because I had never gotten around to it, and now I was glad I hadn't. The realtor came over on a Thursday when Ingrid was at work and walked the property and told me she could list it for $625 and probably get $650. I told her to list it for $650. We signed the paperwork in her car. Then I called my brother in Tucson. He had a guest house behind his place. He'd been telling me for 5 years to come spend a winter. I told him I was thinking about it. I told him I might need the guest house through April. He said come whenever. I did all of this without telling Ingrid any of it. I want to be honest about that. I did not have a confrontation. I did not give her a chance to talk me out of it, or to apologize, or to renegotiate. Some of you will think that was cowardly. I understand. I would have thought it was cowardly too at 30. At 63, I come to believe that some conversations don't deserve to be had because the time for them was years ago and the other side wasn't listening then either. The wedding was on a Saturday. I'd told Ingrid I was driving down to Walla Walla anyway, to drop something off at Bryn's Hotel to give her a card. Ingrid thought that was sweet. She left for the venue at noon. She told me she'd see me at home Sunday night. I packed the truck in 2 hours. I'd done most of the packing already in the basement where she didn't go. Clothes, tools. The boxes from my old office. My father's pocket watch. My first wife's wedding ring, which I kept in a velvet pouch in my sock drawer and which Ingrid had never asked about. The dog. Yes, I took the dog. He was 13. He was mine before the marriage. His name was Buster, and he sat in the passenger seat of the truck with his head on the center console like he'd been waiting for this. I left the house keys on the kitchen counter, on top of an envelope. Inside the envelope was a single sheet of paper. It said, Ingrid, the house is for sale. The realtor's name is on the back of the sheet. My attorney will be in touch by Monday. Don't be wounded. It's not about you. Wesley. I drove to Tucson over 4 days. I stopped at a Motel 6 in Twin Falls the first night, and a Holiday Inn in Salt Lake the second, and a place outside of Flagstaff the third, and I pulled into my brother's driveway on a Wednesday afternoon, and Buster jumped out of the truck and peed on a cactus, and my brother handed me a beer and didn't ask me a single question. The phone call started Sunday night. I let them go to voicemail. Ingrid left 41 voicemails over the course of the next week. I don't know exactly how many because I deleted them in batches without listening past the first 3 sentences. The first 3 sentences were always the same. Wesley. Wesley, please. Wesley, you can't do this. I could. I had. Bryn called too. She left fewer messages. Hers were shorter and angrier. She said I had ruined her wedding. She said the caterer had walked out because of a payment dispute, and the photographer had only shown up for 2 hours because his deposit hadn't cleared. She said her uncle had paid for things in the end, but only after a fight in the parking lot of the venue that everyone had heard. She said, "How could you do this to me, Wesley?" She said you weren't mad. I wasn't mad. I want you to understand that. I want you to understand that. I wasn't mad. Mad is a hot thing, and what I felt was cold. Mad is what you feel when somebody steps on your foot. What I felt was what you feel when you finally understand that the person who'd been standing on your foot for 15 years had been doing it on purpose and had been waiting for you to notice and had thought you never would. The divorce went through in April. Calloway handled it. Ingrid got the contents of the joint accounts, which by that point was about $40,000. She got her car. She got her clothes and her dental hygienist license and her brother and Coeur d'Alene, who turned out, when she actually had to depend on him, to be less generous than he'd seemed when he was offering to spite me at someone else's wedding. The house sold in February for $642. I took the proceeds. Washington is a community property state, but the house was a premarital asset, and I'd never mixed it, and Calloway was very good at his job. I have not spoken to Bryn since the phone call in September. She sent me a letter in March. I read the first page. It was about her therapist and about her process and about how she felt I had punished her for setting a healthy boundary. I put the letter in a drawer. I haven't taken it out. I'm 64 now. I live in Tucson half the year and on the Oregon coast the other half, and a little cottage I bought outright with cash. Buster died last spring. I got another dog, a rescue, a brown mutt with one bad ear, and I named him Slider after that pitch the Mariners pitcher threw on the night everything fell apart. I walk him on the beach every morning. I read in the afternoons. I have a woman friend, a widow named Adele, who lives 2 cottages down, and we have dinner together twice a week, and neither of us has any intention of getting married, and neither of us has any children to disappoint. People ask me sometimes, when the story comes up, if I have regrets. They ask if I miss Bryn. They ask if I wish I'd handled it differently, if I should have sat them down and had it out, if I should have given her a chance to apologize. Here's what I tell them. I spent 15 years showing up. I taught a kid long division at a kitchen table while her mother cried at the stove. I paid for braces and tuition and a Costa Rica trip, and a U-Haul and a therapist she used to figure out that I wasn't her real family. I didn't ask to be called anything. I didn't ask to be loved. I just asked, in the smallest possible way, in the most unspoken way, to be allowed to keep doing what I'd been doing, and for that to mean something to somebody. When she told me the best gift I could give her was to disappear, I gave her the gift. I just gave it bigger than she asked for. I don't need her to be sorry. I don't need her to understand. I built bridges for a living, and I know what happens when you keep loading weight onto a structure that was never bolted down. Eventually, the structure walks away. That's all I did. I walked away, and I sleep now on the Oregon coast with the windows open and a brown dog at the foot of the bed, and I check the math of my days and it adds up clean. Every column, every line, it adds up clean. I've had a lot of quiet mornings on this beach to think about what really happened, and I want to leave you with what I came to. Not as advice, but as the honest tally of one man's life. The math of relationships works the same way the math of bridges does. You can carry an enormous load for an enormous time, but only if the structure is bolted down on both ends. I bolted myself down. I poured myself into that house, into that girl, into that marriage, with everything I had. The other end was never bolted. Ingrid let me carry, and Bryn let me carry, and neither of them ever stood up and said, "This man is anchored to us. This man stays." They liked the bridge. They used the bridge. They didn't see the bridge as part of the landscape they belonged to. That's cause and effect. That's not bitterness. That's geometry. When you give without ever asking to be claimed, you teach the people you love that you can be unclaimed. I taught Bryn that. I taught her with 15 years of small, careful, deferential love that I was the kind of man you could erase from a wedding photograph and the photograph would still hold. And when she finally erased me, she was only doing what I'd quietly trained her to do. I'm not saying it was my fault. I'm saying I had a hand in it, and a grown man owes himself that honesty. So if you're listening to this and you're somewhere in the middle of a story like mine, here is what I'd tell you from one tired man to another. Be good, stay decent, pay for the braces if you have the money and the heart for it. But somewhere, early on, plant your flag. Tell the kid what you are to her and let her tell you back. Don't be so afraid of pushing that you let yourself become furniture. Furniture gets moved. Furniture gets sold. Furniture doesn't get invited to the wedding. And know your own mind. Build a life that doesn't collapse if one person decides you're optional. Keep one account in your name. Keep one set of keys to one door that only opens for you. Keep your father's pocket watch and your first wife's ring and the dog that loved you before the marriage. Those things are not selfishness. Those things are the anchor. The strength isn't in shouting. It isn't in arguing. It isn't in standing in a kitchen and demanding to be loved. The strength is in being the kind of man who, when somebody finally tells him the truth, can hear it, accept it, and walk out into the morning with his head clear and his ledger clean. Bryn is 27 now. I hope she's happy. I hope she figures out what she really wanted that day at the winery in Walla Walla. I won't be there to see it. That's how it goes. The bridge stands or it doesn't. I checked the math. I walked away. And the days since then have added up clean.